The concept of prefiguration is highly debated in the context of social change. This short video will give us an introduction to what prefiguration is, and then some of the arguments for and against prefiguration. One of the first definitions for prefiguration comes from Carl Boggs in an article written in 1977 titled Marxism, Prefigurative Communism, and the Problem of Workers' Control. Boggs says, and I quote, "In the past century, the most direct attack on statist Marxism has come from what might be called the prefigurative tradition, which begins with the 19th century anarchists and includes the syndicalists, council communists, and the New Left. By prefigurative, I mean the embodiment within ongoing political practice of a movement of those forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal." Now in 2015, Luke Yates, in an article titled Rethinking Prefiguration, Alternatives, Micropolitics, and Goals in Social Movements, gives us probably a more concise and easy to work with definition, which makes sense since his article is coming 30-ish plus years later. He says, prefiguration refers to the attempted construction of an alternative or utopian social relations in the present, either in parallel with or in the course of adversarial social movement protest. The concept of prefiguration really sort of congealed and started getting a lot of debate on its side, kind of in response to authoritarian Marxist or authoritarian socialist movements and their failure at resulting in real long-term social change. As Bogg refers to in his article, this actually begins with the anarchists in the 19th century and on to the 20th century, who argue against basically the socialist concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning that the workers, the state would take control of the means of production and so on, and then through that control would implement a sort of socialist and then eventually a higher stage of communist society. The prefigurative argument is that a dictatorship, no matter how benign it might be, even a dictatorship of the proletariat, would always result in a dictatorial society. That in order to build a peaceful, egalitarian society and so on, the movement itself must be peaceful and egalitarian. So it really originates from around that time and in a response to authoritarian Marxism. There are two main sort of lines of argument in support of prefiguration. The first one is the means-ends equivalent. And this is sort of the idea. Samuel Farber has an article titled Reflections on Prefigurative Politics from the International Socialist Review that provides a really good overview of this concept. And he says the means-ends equivalence argument is basically that, quote, there is a one-to-one correspondence between the strategies and tactics adopted to fight exploitation and oppression, including the right of the oppressed to resort to force and violence, and those followed by a future society. So the means-ends equivalence argument is essentially that the means through which you are seeking social change, whether that's violent or nonviolent and so on, are correlated exactly to the future society that you seek. So the means are correlated to the end. So if you have a violent method of social change, then the society in the future will also be violent. If you have peaceful social change, the society will be peaceful. And there are two lines of argument underneath the means-ends equivalent sort of logic. The first one is the ethical argument. And this argument is that the right thing to do is to create a social movement that embodies the value of the future society that you seek. So it's sort of like the moral argument, that if you want a peaceful society in the future, then the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do, would be to formulate a movement that itself is peaceful. The second line of thinking under the means-ends equivalence is the instrumental argument, and this is that the most effective way to bring out a new society is to formulate a movement that embodies the values of the future society. So that this has nothing to do with whether it's right or wrong, this is merely how effective it might be. So this argument is that if we want to bring about a peaceful future society, that the best, most effective way to do that is to have a peaceful movement, and so on. And then Uri Gordon actually has a great article titled Prefigurative Politics Between Ethical Practice and Absent Promise. And he provides another nuance to the instrumental argument. What he calls it path-dependency. And I'll quote him. He says, "This argument, with its embryonic metaphor, refers to what today might be called a path-dependency between revolutionary practices and results, where initial moves in one direction elicit further moves in that same direction, and the trajectory of change up to a certain point constrains the trajectory after that point." So as part of the means-ends equivalent, this path-dependency argument basically argues that if you start a movement along a certain path, then it will end up along this same path, and that the society that results out of this movement will be along that path as well. So using just the example of violence or nonviolence, if we start a nonviolent movement, that will lead us on this certain trajectory. It will lead us on this path, and as a result, the actions and decisions made by this movement throughout time will result in a nonviolent and peaceful society. And then the opposite argument of that would be, if we have a violent movement, that leads us also on a very specific path, and the society that that results out of that movement would be violent as well. So that's sort of the path dependency argument by Uri Gordon, and that kind of sums up the means-ends equivalence, whether it's ethical, the right thing to do, or instrumental, sort of the best, most effective way to make social change. In addition to the means-ends equivalence argument, there is an argument that has to do with building alternatives. Luke Yates, in the article mentioned earlier, he says here, quote, "Prefiguration is doing extra activities or projects alongside adversarial protests rather than a dynamic underpinning it." So he says that it doesn't necessarily have to be that the movement is only prefigurative, but the building alternatives argument is that we build alternatives to society that exist, that is prefiguration. That if we are taking part in sort of communal experiments in living and so on, that we are building alternatives to current society, mainstream society. That if we're trying to change society, that we will be building sort of an alternative society alongside the rest of the social movement and alongside a mainstream society. And there are three main functions that people talk about that this building alternatives can serve. The first function of a prefigurative alternative is experimentation. And the theory behind this is that we can't possibly be expected to sort of know what a future society could look like from our lens deep within mainstream current society, the status quo essentially. So the experimental function is that through having prefigurative projects, whether that's a commune or just some kind of alternative to capitalist mainstream society or industrial society or technological society, that these experimentations, out of these experimentations will come ideas for how a future society could be structured, how it could be constructed, how people could communicate and work alongside one another, how they could get along, sort of rules for collective decision making, etc. This idea would come out of experimentation. That basically it's impossible for these ideas to come out of just living within mainstream society. And one really interesting example that people point to in sort of this experimentation function is the idea of consensus decision making, and really formalized strategies and tactics and procedures to follow to have a sort of efficient consensus decision making practices, that those came out of sort of anarchist collectives and mutualist groups and communal living environments, and they really became formalized and it became efficient as a result of these experiments, these prefigurative experiments that were happening. That those didn't come out of just mainstream sort of capitalist industrial society, and the argument here is that it would have been impossible for them to come out of that type of interaction, that type of society. So that's the experimentation function that prefigurative alternatives can serve. The second function that prefigurative alternatives can really serve within individuals is the subjective function. The idea here is that living through a prefigurative experiment, really having that experience, changes who we are as human beings, changes what we want out of society, what we value, our emotional capacity, and so on. In fact, David Graeber has a really good quote from an article called The New Anarchists, A Movement of Movements, in the New Left Review that he wrote in 2002. And this is his quote. He says, "It's difficult to find anyone who has fully participated in such an action whose sense of human possibilities has not been profoundly transformed as a result. It is one thing to say another world is possible. It is another to experience, however momentarily." End quote. So he's basically saying, just taking part in these experiments and these prefigurative projects changes who we are as human beings. It opens our minds up to new possibilities. It gives us new experiences with the world and with other human beings, and it changes us. It makes us into different people. The types of people, the argument goes, that could bring about this new future society, whatever type of society that we are working towards. The third function of prefigurative projects is the discursive function. And this has to do with language, basically. Slavoj Žižek has a quote that I like to use here. He says, "We feel free because we lack the very language to articulate our unfreedom." And so the discursive function of prefigurative projects is basically that we don't have the language, like the literal words to use to describe what kind of future society we want. We don't know how to describe our unfreedom, to use Zizek's term. These words don't exist because our language, our discourses are so dominated by statist discourse, capitalist discourse, patriarchal discourse, heteronormative discourse, white discourse, on and on. All of the ways that we are oppressed, our language reflects that oppression, and the dominant discourses of our time reflect that oppression, to where any language that would have to do with freedom and liberation and so on has been so subjugated that it's erased from the dominant discourse. And the argument here, this discursive function of prefigurative projects, is that we can only formulate that language by prefiguring alternate experiences outside of the heteronormative, capitalist, white, and so on society. So we can only escape that society, even if it's only for a very brief moment, if we create a prefigurative project that allows us to escape that discourse for a moment. We can develop this new language and develop this new way of thinking and communicating with one another that would then bring about the new type of society, this future that we seek. So that's the discursive function. Now, what are some main arguments against prefiguration? We won't dwell on this one for too long, but I'll give you an idea of just some of these lines of thinking. One of the main thoughts is that existing society will never change as a result of exiting society unless a massive critical mass of people all leave at the same time. So this idea of like creating this prefigurative project is nice, but that will never actually create real change in society unless we somehow create a prefigurative project, an alternate society that is so popular that it attracts a huge critical mass of people and that they abandon mainstream society. And the argument goes that that's basically impossible, that that could never happen, that we're up against such massive propaganda machines and bureaucracies and so on that are interested in maintaining the status quo, that creating that type of project and attracting a critical mass of people is basically impossible. Another line of thinking within the same argument actually comes from Murray Bookchin in his book Social Anarchism or Lifestyle Anarchism, An Unbridgeable Chasm. And in this one, he basically, the whole thesis of the book is arguing against lifestyle anarchism, which is prefigurative politics, basically. He argues that this is kind of the coward's way out, that it is an attempt to sort of escape the real battle, which is the difficult battle, the most challenging battle, which is basically fighting the massive, violent opponent head on. If the opponent is a mainstream capitalist industrialist society, he argues that trying to exit society, taking part in a prefigurative project, is just an attempt to avoid that fight. So that's Bookchin's argument against prefigurative politics. One of the other main arguments against prefiguration is that a non-violent movement will never be capable of defeating a highly armed and organized and experienced in using violence opponent. That we can, this is the main argument against a nonviolent movement, that a nonviolent movement would never defeat a violent status quo. In fact, this is the main argument, I think, of most socialists against the anarchist movement. The argument is that sort of non-hierarchical, even if it's a violent anarchist movement, will never be organized enough to defeat a very bureaucratic and hierarchical and experienced violent, let's just use the terms, military and law enforcement agencies, that an anarchist movement would never be able to do that. And the socialist logic is, of course, that a highly organized socialist movement would be able to do that. But that's one argument against prefiguration, that a nonviolent movement will never defeat a very violent and experienced opponent, in this case, capitalist, industrial, technologically advanced capitalism, neoliberalism, colonialism, and so on. And then one of the final arguments is kind of related to that one. It has to do with purely hierarchy and kind of bureaucracy. And the argument is that a non-hierarchical prefigurative movement will never be able to defeat a hierarchical bureaucratic opponent, the status quo, essentially. The argument here is that modern capitalism, neoliberalism, global economics, all of these structures are so highly hierarchical and as a result so highly bureaucratized and organized and efficient and really, really good at what they do that a non-hierarchical and non-hierarchical prefigurative movement would be incapable of defeating that opponent. However, I will say that there's another argument against that one, which is that perhaps that's the real value of a non-hierarchical prefigurative movement, is that it can kind of attack this hierarchical opponent at its weakest point. So the hierarchical opponent would not be really good at kind of attacking the non-hierarchical movement because it doesn't really have experience with how to do that. And it's so bureaucratized that essentially there's no manual that it has. It doesn't have decades or centuries of experience dealing with non-hierarchical entities because it's become so proficient at dealing in terms of hierarchy. So that's just sort of a brief definition of prefiguration. Some of the arguments for prefiguration, the arguments against prefiguration, some of the terminology that's used in this debate, some resources that you can look up on your own, and we'll provide links down in the video description as well as some of these articles. But yeah, that's prefiguration in a nutshell.